Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to learn about communication. You know, I am so excited to be able to share this with you. I've shared this with couples for years, and we've had couples that were ready to divorce, and I think a few that even had divorced and learned these communication skills and were able to get their relationship restored. So regardless of where you're at, where your relationship is not going well, or if you're just learning this as premarital or as preventative. And I want you to know this is not just for marital relationships. It can help in any relationship. It can make you a better employee, a better boss, a better neighbor, parent, whatever. And what I'm going to share with you came out of over 30 years of research by two major universities. And they studied what worked and what didn't work. And they put this program together. And then someone looked at it and said, well, you know, that's exactly what the Bible teaches. So we've got the secular side that agrees on this and the biblical side. And, you know, whether you're a believer or not, these principles will work. And you've got to admit that if everybody would keep the 10 Commandments that the Bible teaches, this would be a better world to live in. We wouldn't have to live in fear, and we could leave our doors unlocked and walk the streets at night without fear. So these principles will work for you, and so hang in with us and as we get going here. You know, I have told couples for years that came to see me for help in counseling that you are set up for trouble. Now, I say that kind of jokingly, but there is some truth to it, and here's what I mean by that. Just as different as we are on a physical level between male and female, we're pretty much that different in other areas in the way that we view things. And we've got to keep in mind that that is by God's design. God made us totally different to give us different viewpoints. Now, somebody once said, if you both thought just alike, one of you would be unnecessary. Now, I didn't say that, but somebody did. But so God has given us, the ladies, an intuition that we guys don't have, that they just know things without knowing how they know it, without any logic being to it. But that's part of God's design. Then the other issue that we have is we have two different backgrounds, two different sets of beliefs on how to handle situations. You know, he's got one view and she's got another, and so we clash in that. So that's what I mean, set up for trouble. And then a lot of times we have second or third marriages with kids, and that brings on another complicated issue. So what I want you to keep in mind is that you're always, always, always going to have issues to deal with. Okay? Now, the key is learning to deal with these issues the right way. Because what happens is, since you're going to have issues, and if you don't have the communication skills to deal with the issues properly, then you accumulate unresolved issues. And unresolved issues create separation. And the more unresolved issues, the more separation you have. And I can't stretch far enough sometimes to illustrate that. So that's where the communication comes in, so we can resolve the unresolved, because if you don't, that's what leads to divorce, or to say the least, a miserable marriage. And I don't want you living in a miserable marriage, and neither does God. But there is a way that we can come together and to learn those. And a couple of things to remember. What couples usually think is the problem is not the real problem. And we're going to see that more as we go through this process. And I try to get couples, you know, don't focus on what you think is wrong with your mate. Because again, that's usually not the problem. So put your energies into learning communication skills so that we can resolve the unresolved. Now, where I want us to start to kind of build a base on this is let's look at Adam and Eve in Genesis. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And then the next verse says, "The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." Now, this no shame could mean several things, but at the least, I think we could agree that it meant there were no barriers to intimacy, there was no fear in the relationship, there were no negative patterns that had built up. In other words, they were open. And then, of course, we know that sin entered the world, and fear entered the world, and fear entered into the relationship. And we see in Genesis 3:7, it says, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." And then in verse 8 it says, "Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord among the trees in the garden." And we can see here that the intimacy that God wanted between him and his children and between Adam and Eve had been shattered. And we see that in Genesis 3:9, it says, "But the Lord God called the man, 'Where are you?' And he answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, so I hid.'" And we can see here that the oneness that God wanted and the intimacy that God wanted was broken. And a key word here is fear. See, it's out of fear that we put up barriers in our relationships. Of course, the antidote to fear is love. 1 John 4:18 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear." And, you know, I believe for a long time that I think fear may be one of our greatest sins. That's why God said 365 times in his word to fear not. That's one for every day of the year. And in these verses, we see a couple of things that's very important. That is one flesh with no shame. In other words, God wanted oneness between Adam and Eve, between the man and his wife. And God also wanted permanence. Okay? We see in Matthew 19:6 that the word said, "Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate." So God wanted permanence, but he also created marriage to be satisfying. And if it's not satisfying, then there's a reason for it, because God created it to be satisfying, and we've got to have the oneness in order for that to happen. Now, what the first thing I want us to look at here too is that there are three barriers to oneness. This oneness that God wanted for us. One of them is the fear of rejection and self-protection. The next one is sin and selfishness, and the other one is lack of knowledge. And there's a couple of places. Isaiah 5:13 said, "My people are in captivity because they've rejected knowledge." Hosea 4:6 said, "My people are destroyed because of a lack of knowledge." So what we want to do, I'm going to give you the knowledge that you're going to need here that you can use, and we're going to also talk about how to break these barriers. Now, there are some other barriers here to the oneness, and we call them communication danger signs. And the first one is escalation, and we all know what that is. Where partners respond back and forth in a negative way, and tones begin to change, and attitudes change, and we know that about 3 minutes of that, and this conversation is toast. We're not going to get anywhere. So a couple of scriptures about that. Proverbs 20 verse 3 says, "It is to a man's honor to avoid strife, but every fool is quick to quarrel." And then Proverbs 29:11, "A fool gives full vent to anger, but the wise quietly holds it back." And then in 1 Peter 3:9 it says, "Do not repay evil for evil or insult with insult, but with a blessing for that which you were called, so that you might inherit a blessing." So when someone comes at you, rather than going back at them, you're supposed to bless them. And if we can learn to realize that when our mate comes at us, that there's probably something going on, and rather than coming back with a bad attitude with them, that we can say, you know, there must be something going on. Tell me what's going on with you. So we need to learn to do that. And 1 Peter 3:10 says, "Those who desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit." So escalation can be a big problem. The next danger sign is what we call invalidation. Invalidation is when we put down the thoughts, the feelings or the character of another person. In other words, we get into name calling. And to give you some examples of this, in other words, putting down the thoughts, if I were to say to you, well, why would you think that? See, just in my tone and just in that question itself, I'm really saying that, there's something wrong with the way you're thinking. And then the other is when we put down the feelings. Well, you shouldn't feel that way, or why would you feel that way? In other words, we're implying that there's something wrong. And as soon as we do that, we're gonna shut our mates down. And something I want you to remember about feelings is feelings aren't good, bad, right or wrong. They're just feelings. And it's okay to feel what you feel. Now, that we know that we can't make decisions based on how we feel because our feelings will lie to us. So keep that in mind. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 12:18, reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. And I'm going to come back to this invalidation because it's a big, big deal, but I want to cover these other two. The third danger sign and barrier to oneness is negative or misinterpretation. You're trying to say one thing, they're hearing another. Okay? So, and this happens when one partner consistently believes that the motives of the other are more negative than they really are. Another verse about that, 1 Corinthians 13:6 said, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. And so that was another one that we need to speak the truth in love. And in the next verse, love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. And then the last danger sign, I think, comes as a result of the first three things that's been happening, and that's withdrawal. If one partner brings up an issue, the other wants to withdraw, or just avoidance to even try to communicate. And the reason that happens is you have not been successful in dealing with your issues. It's always a fight. We don't get anywhere, and so I'm just not going to bring anything up. And so that's a real problem because remember, these unresolved issues create separation, and it's separation that leads to divorce, to having a miserable marriage. Ephesians 4:25 says, therefore each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, and your mate's your neighbor, okay? For we are all members of one body. And it says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Now then, I want to go back to this invalidation because this is a major, major issue when it comes to communication. And you're going to think I've got off track, but I'm going to bring this back here in a minute. We've got to keep in mind that how God created us. We know that God is love. And he created us with a need for love. Since he's the supplier and we have the need, it was to bring us to a relationship with him. But I've said for years that this love need that we have is the most powerful force in the universe. It's what drives all behavior. Everything that people are doing is trying to meet this need for love that God has put within us. Now I'll tell you two quick stories. They're not pleasant stories, but you need to hear them. Many years ago, there were some doctors having a get-together. I guess they were pediatricians, and some of them, in their discussions, shared that they had delivered perfectly healthy babies, yet these babies refused to nurse, and they starved to death and died. They wanted to know why. When they went back home, each of them contacted the mothers that had lost babies under those circumstances and really inquired and studied it. They found one common denominator with every one of these women. You know what it was? Not one of them wanted their babies. And that is so sad. And those doctors don't know how, but they were convinced that somehow, on some level, those babies knew they weren't wanted. They knew they weren't loved. And they chose death. Back in the 80s in Germany, they separated perfectly healthy, identical twins at birth. One of them they loved and nurtured as most parents do. The other one, they fed it when it was hungry. They changed the diaper when wet. But they didn't rock it. They didn't talk to it. They didn't love it. The baby lived 30 days. And I tell you that so that you can begin to get a handle on how powerful that this need for love is that God has put within us. And when that need is not met, you're going to do something. Okay? You're going to do something in order to try to get that need met. Now, when we dissect love, we kind of break it apart. What are the components of this need that I have? We're going to see three key elements. We all have a need to be significant, important. We all have a need to be accepted. And we all have a need for a sense of belonging, to fit in, to be a part of something. And I want to refer you to, some of you know about the Tower of Babel that the Bible talks about in Genesis chapter 11. And the NIV version says this the best. And here's what it says, Genesis 11:4 NIV. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower which will reach into the heavens so that," okay, here's why we want to do this, "so that we might make a name for ourselves and that we might not be scattered." What is there in making a name for yourself? Hey, look at me. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've accomplished. Look at what I've built. Significance. Okay? With significance, almost always comes acceptance. Think about all your movie stars and your singers and your ball players. Everywhere they go, you've got a crowd of people because we see them as significant figures. So that acceptance goes right along with that. And then the people said that we might not be scattered. That's that need for a sense of belonging, that need to fit in. See, that's why gangs are so powerful. That's why cliques work so well. That, we all have this need to fit in. So we're going to talk about these quite a bit, but always remember significance, acceptance, and sense of belonging. And you're also going to see that when that is not being met, when you sense that need's not being met by your mate, that's what leads to all the fights. Every fight that probably you've ever had, we could unpeel that, so to speak, unlayer it, and we could get back to somebody's not feeling significant, accepted, or not having a sense of belonging. So one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that to God, you are significant. To God, you are accepted, and you do have a sense of belonging with Him. And so that's the end of this first session. We've got there's some things that I want you to focus on here before you go any further. That you're always going to have issues. Unresolved issues create separation. Stop looking at what's wrong with your mate. Put your energies into learning. And this need for significance, acceptance, and sense of belonging. Again, all your issues go back to that. So till next time, focus on these, learn these. We've got 2 more sessions, and then we'll be complete with the communication series. Till next time, God bless.